morning, everyone. If you haven't figured out by our scripture, we're about to dive into Habakkuk this morning. Thank you. So I hope you guys are ready. Last week, we looked at Isaiah and how he prayed to God. So we looked at, if you weren't here, Isaiah was a prophet. So we just looked at how he prays to God. Now, today we don't have time to go into all of the details, and for clarity's sake, historically and chronologically, Habakkuk comes before Isaiah. So Habakkuk is like, wow, I just got hot here. What Teresa said this morning, that, it's a conversation between God and Habakkuk. This conversation is happening before the Babylonians conquered Judah. And so Isaiah is happening while they're in the midst of the Babylonian rule. So the book of Habakkuk, this conversation, is finished off with a humbling and faithful prayer. So I do want us to remember that as we're going through this morning. So we're going to look at how he teaches us. Habakkuk teaches us how we can talk with God when all seems to be going wrong. We will look at how Habakkuk laments towards God, how he names what is happening, and how he remains faithful and humbled with the answer he receives. I would say similarly, Habakkuk, like Isaiah, is really uncomfortable to read. So I ask you this morning that you would have open ears to hear what God has to say to you. So I'm going to look at the first part of the reading from this morning again. I'm going to be reading from the ESV version, but it's Habakkuk 1 and 2 through 4. And it says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice just never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." How many of us have phrased our prayers in this manner towards God? How often have you prayed to God about the problems that we face in our world today? How often have you prayed about the injustices we see happening all over the world, in our own country, in our own state, in our own city? What has lamenting looked like for you in your life? See, Habakkuk isn't afraid or hesitant to let God know how he feels about what he sees going on, or all around him. What I hear, and I want you to hear, is Habakkuk is complaining or lamenting towards God. And rather than him going to anyone else, he's taking all of that to God, because he knows God is the one who can do something about them. But I also want us to note that Habakkuk isn't shaking his finger at God. Rather, he has a tone and a posture of grief and sorrow towards God. For instance, when we have experienced a loss of a loved one, this is kind of a similar posture we can have towards God, because initially we automatically feel that separation. When someone dies, we experience that. We are reminded that things are just not right yet. And it still felt deeply, and it's still painful. And we can always tend to roll through those questions of, why don't you just come now, God? You see what's happening. You see that there's death. And I know death is conquered, but why don't you just come again? We're waiting. And this is a process of how we are trying to make sense of the world and why we're still here. and why God hasn't returned yet. But Habakkuk does something similar. He names the things that are happening amongst God's people that are horrendous. And there is a separation of what represents God and what doesn't. And there seems to be more of the other. He says, why do you sit idly watching this happen, God? Don't you see what I see? Don't you see? The people don't want to hear your instruction or correction. Your people, they love violence and destruction. They want this. It's everywhere. And justice, well, forget about justice. It's warped. It's non-existent. Really, the majority of God's own people do not want anything to do with God. So can you hear Habakkuk's grief and sorrow? Because he does know his true God. He knows his love for the Lord. But he says, what are you doing? So while Habakkuk prays for a while, and we note that in the very beginning, because he says he's been praying for a little bit about these issues, then what finally happens? We don't know how long it took, but God responds. And he responds that Babylon will conquer Judah. What? This is not like, I just listed a bunch of things that are going wrong. I'm hoping you're going to come in and save us and do, your thing. Can you believe what his answer is? God? And Habakkuk, that is not what the answer he was expecting either. But I do want to know, God responded. And so we have to be like, hey, he responded. So after this happens, Habakkuk gets a response from God. Habakkuk makes his, I don't even want to say a fit, but just his complaint of why God would allow Babylon to conquer them, how bad they are, that God is allowing this to happen, but God is allowing Habakkuk to ask these questions that are feeling heated. But I see God being very gracious and merciful towards God, or to Habakkuk, because he is allowing Habakkuk to ask these questions. And in that, because Habakkuk is making these questions and claims to God, God is able, in the midst of all of that, he's, in his response, able to open Habakkuk's eyes to say, look at how my people have been. They must learn, right? Things to remember is that Habakkuk's tone towards God is of genuine lamenting for answers from God. He is going to God with trust and safety. He knows he can come to God and ask him all the questions that he needs to ask him. And it's okay if he's angry. It's okay if he's sad. He could be happy. He could be joyful. But the way in which Habakkuk is asking the questions is not of like questioning God's authority. Habakkuk's questioning is as, I know you are the God of all gods, of everything. You are the creator. You are the one who has the power to fix these things. He is making known that even in his complaint, he knows he's the God who can undo it all, who can fix it all. And so God receives his questioning as a place because he knows his son loves him. So in that, God's response to Habakkuk is one, to me, like a parent. Sometimes we intervene to help our kids when we see them about to stumble, when they're first starting to walk, or there's learning certain issues and how to not make a wrong decision and all those things. But there are times where we intervene, right? And there are times where we just let them make their own decisions and let them find out for themselves. And then maybe they will see that we were trying to guide them in the right direction. I can think of a time when I had my very first boyfriend. Yes. What? I can tell you that the very first time my dad met him, and he did come to the house, and he had to do the whole, like, hey, may I date your daughter, those kinds of things. My dad told me later that evening that that boy is no good. He is not a good guy. And I, being really close to my dad and feeling very trusting, I trusted my dad. I was like, well, how can you tell if the first time you met him? I was like, again, note that I valued my dad's advice. Okay, I just want to say that. But I was like, but in this situation, I was like, but he hasn't known him very long, and I know him, and he goes to church, and I'm just listing all these things. Did my dad say I couldn't date him? Nope. He just allowed me to find out all on my own, and I did find out that he was no good. I learned my lesson, and just so you know, kids, parents know. They do. Parents know. I share this because God has been there to save the Israelites over and over and over and over again. And he's been trying to give his kids the advice, and they're just not willing to hear it. They're not ready to receive it. And he is letting them essentially find out for themselves. How many times do we like to tell God that we know better? That he just doesn't know, or he just doesn't understand? After all of this, Habakkuk responds with faithfulness. Even though he knows what's going to happen, God's told him, he knows what's going to happen, he still remains faithful in his response. And it reminded me when I read that is of James chapter 1, 2-3. And it says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds, for it is the testing of your faith that produces steadfastness. And so in James, he's not saying if you will face trials, it's when you will face trials. And Habakkuk, he's about to see his people face a very big trial. But we are all facing trials of various kinds, and it is to produce a bigger faithfulness, and says, let that faithfulness make you complete, like being even more complete in God. We don't always get the luxury of knowing what bad stuff is going to happen. And it can be hard and for our minds and feel unprepared to deal with it when it comes. This morning, I hope you can walk in God's grace and love. I hope you may have even more endurance for the things that will come. But I also want you to not feel too proud to go to God with your complaints, or your lamenting, your grief, and your sorrow, because God can absolutely handle it. I also want to challenge you, and I want you to examine your own life of where you're actually not trusting God at all. Is God calling you to respond like Habakkuk? Though he has heard what is going to happen, Habakkuk does tremble. We hear in chapter 3 later on, he talks about trembling. He knows what's going to happen. It doesn't mean that he is not faithful to the Lord, but he is truly a human being, and he's scared what's going to happen. But he still says, chapter 3, verses 17-19, and if you'll just close your eyes with me. Well, I'll open my eyes, but you close your eyes and just hear these words of Habakkuk. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places.